Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
The Cold War was between the United States and the Soviet Union. While going through the Cold War, Germany was split into 4 parts: the American part, the British part, the French part, and the Russian part. The eastern area was given to the Soviet Union, and the western area was given to the United States. Fidel Castro came to power but had issues with poverty. He was constantly ready to attack the United States and make friends with Russia. He was an anti-American, making the rest of Cuba anti-American under his power. His guerrilla army overthrew Fulgencio Batista, the American-backed Cuban dictator. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born into money and high-class citizenship. He was seated into the House of Representatives, agreed with Truman's foreign policies, and criticized the administration's stand against Communist China. From 1941 to 1945, he served in the military. He won the election into Senate in 1952. During the Cold War, the United States started a policy called containment. The containment policy was a wish to contain communism and keep it from spreading to other non-communist countries. Eastern Europe was lost to communism, and many people wanted to go there to crush it out. The United States ended up keeping the communism to the east, but still, we did not crush it out fully. George Kennan once said, "Containment provided a conceptual framework for a series of successful initiatives undertaken from 1947 to 1950 to blunt Soviet expansion." The Truman Doctrine was based off the containment policy. It was an establishment made by President Harry S. Truman for peace and support with a goal to stop Soviet expansion. The United States believed that the USSR supported Greek and Turkish communists, and therefore this led to the United States being involved in external country affairs. The Bay of Pigs tainted JFK's legacy. One piece that was crucial to understand was that the CIA gave terrible intelligence, leading everyone astray in the beginning. First of all, there was severely bad planning. The Army did not seem to notice and plan for the time shift and how it would affect them. There was disaster before the United States boats reached the shore, and they were hit with heavy fire as soon as they reached Cuba. The attack didn't even last 24 hours. Information leaked and caused Castro to hear about the attack. Castro got wind of the plan and moved his air force into bunkers so they weren't damaged by this invasion. American troops met with Cuban troops in airplanes that got direction from Castro. The U.S. force was completely unprepared and hadn't done any apparent research on some very important factors in their attack. For example, bad weather in Cuba led to having to use soggy equipment during the attack. The United States did not bring enough troops to overpower Castro's forces. The American forces arrived late, bringing no support for those already there, and the time changes between the United States and Cuba faltered the soldiers' coordinated attack.
A different one of Kennedy's failures includes how he dealt with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. This shows because of how disastrous the Vienna summit talks ended up, some of the letters Kennedy sent and received, the impressions he made and perceived of and to Khrushchev, and the results of his dealings. By the end of the summit talks, JFK felt that the Vienna summit talks were a complete and utter failure. One reason that the Vienna summit talks failed could have been because of the impressions that Kennedy and Khrushchev made and received of each other were none too high. Khrushchev thought that Kennedy was too young to be an effective leader, and in turn, Kennedy thought Khrushchev was the single most cold-hearted person he had ever met. Kennedy stated after the Vienna talks, "I talked about how a nuclear exchange would kill 70 million people in 10 minutes, and he just looked at me as if to say, 'So what?'" Kennedy's statement goes to show just how much tension there was between the two leaders. The letters that Kennedy sent and received were one of Kennedy's mistakes because of how accusatory quite a few of the letters were. In one letter, Kennedy questioned if Khrushchev truly cared about the welfare of his people, and if he had pushed the boundaries much further, he might have provoked the Soviets into starting a nuclear war. Therefore, Kennedy's dealing with Khrushchev revealed his inexperience with foreign affairs. In spite of Kennedy's difficult relationship with Khrushchev, the Cuban Missile Crisis allowed Kennedy to emerge as a hero to the world. A hero is recognized as someone who is idealized or praised for their courageous or outstanding actions, and Kennedy could be defined as a hero for his part in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis began when a U-2 spy plane flying over and near Cuba picked up nuclear radiation, and after further inquiry and investigation, it was found that Cuba was building nuclear missile launch sites capable of striking the United States. As this crisis ensued, JFK created a new group called ExComm, Executive Committee of the National Security Council. ExComm was a group of government officials whose job it was to convene and basically act as presidential advisors. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, their main job was to work out all the options that Kennedy had open to him and advise him on what to do. ExComm met several times throughout the 13 days of the crisis, and they came up with a couple of ideas, including beginning a nuclear war involving Cuba, Russia, and the United States. But that would kill millions of people in a matter of hours, so they ruled that option out. They also came up with the idea to stop all boat travel to and from Cuba. This option was taken upon, and JFK ordered a naval quarantine to surround Cuba, stopping all boat travel to Cuba. Kennedy was heroic in choosing that option because had he ordered further attacks or any other violent solution, hundreds of millions of people would have died, and he protected his country and other countries from mass destruction by the naval quarantine, which was justified by the containment policy that prevented the spread of communism out of the Eastern Hemisphere, and that was what the quarantine was for.
Kennedy had two options when dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis. One was the violent path and the other was the peaceful path. Kennedy could have sent an airstrike on Cuba. He could have also started a nuclear war, which would have killed millions of Americans, Cubans, and Soviets. The other was the peaceful path. Instead of trying to start nuclear war, Kennedy sent letters to Khrushchev trying to work things out and not kill millions. After finding the missiles in Cuba, Kennedy decided to put Cuba in quarantine. Quarantine means to impose isolation on a person, animal, or place. This quarantine was to stop ships from getting into Cuba and stop the building of missiles. Kennedy told his men to board the ships and check to see if they had warheads or weapons on them. If they didn't, they were allowed to keep moving. The quarantine didn't end when the Cuban Missile Crisis ended. Kennedy kept the quarantine until the Soviets agreed to move their Il-28 bombers from Cuba. The Soviets removed the bombers in 1962. Kennedy, to most people, was a hero during his presidency. People admired him for his leadership and willing to take risks to save lives. People also thought he could change the nation and world. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "We mourned a man who became the pride of the nation." After the Cuban Missile Crisis was over, there was an important event that occurred. The event was when the United States had to take the missiles out of Turkey. This was done because of an agreement Khrushchev and Kennedy made. This agreement stated that Khrushchev agreed to take the missiles out of Cuba and that the U.S. would take their missiles out of Turkey. After the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, the relationship between the countries had changed. Russia and America were not too friendly after the near disaster. The relationship was even worse and even less trusting. Cuba and the U.S. do not have a formal relationship today, although the tense feelings have died down in the last few years. The choices Khrushchev made during the Cuban Missile Crisis backfired on him in the end. Khrushchev's hardliners were absolutely appalled by his decision to withdraw the weapons from Cuba. A few years later, in 1964, Khrushchev was removed from his leadership by Brezhnev and Kozygin. Brezhnev and Kozygin also wanted to strengthen the Soviet Union militarily without Khrushchev getting in their way. One invention during the Cuban Missile Crisis was the Red Line. The Red Line directly connects the Pentagon to the Kremlin. It was the way of communication during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but was mainly just letters. These were slow and took a lot of time to get from America to Russia. Many people thought, and still think, that if there was a faster method than letters as communication, the crisis might have been solved sooner. To sum up the importance of the Cuban Missile Crisis is America became aware of how fast war could break out and how fast the world can escalate into chaos.